When people think about medieval warfare, they usually picture battles in spring or summer, not armies trying to survive snow, ice, and freezing wind. But war in medieval Europe did not always stop when winter began. Soldiers still had to march, guard fortresses, feed horses, find shelter, and stay alive in some of the harshest conditions of the year. So how did medieval armies actually survive winter campaigns? And what made some of them capable of fighting when others simply could not? Number 1. Winter wasn't over. One of the biggest myths about medieval warfare is that armies simply packed up the moment snow arrived. What usually ended was the main campaign season, not war itself. In much of medieval Europe, armies were commonly raised for a season from spring into autumn, and many were indeed disbanded or sent home in early winter. In some later medieval settings, the traditional campaign season could begin in March and run through autumn and even into December, which already tells you the calendar was more flexible than the stereotype suggests. Temporary forces could go home while garrisons, household troops, paid retainers, and whatever core force a ruler could maintain kept the conflict alive. If a ruler had money, a strong reason to stay in the field, and some way to feed both men and horses, winter operations could continue. That is why Charlemagne maintained the siege of Pavia through the winter of 773 to 774, why William I carried out the harrying of the north in the winter of 1069 to 1070, and why later commanders in the Hundred Years' War used winter quarters as bases instead of treating winter like a hard stop. So the real question is not whether medieval armies campaigned in winter. They did. The real question is, under what conditions winter campaigning was worth the cost? And once you look at it that way, the answer becomes much clearer. Winter did not make war impossible. It made every mistake more expensive. That changed the size of armies, the speed of marches, the choice of targets, and even the kind of commanders who could stay active. In summer, an army could move fast and live more easily off the countryside. In winter, a commander needed a narrower goal and tighter control. That usually meant suppressing a rebellion, holding a frontier, blockading a fortress, or staying close to a good supply line instead of chasing one big, decisive battle. Medieval war still moved in winter, just in a more selective, costly, and disciplined way. Number 2. Food before steel. Once that is clear, the next part follows naturally. Medieval armies survived winter by treating food as the first weapon. A freezing night was dangerous, but hunger broke armies faster than cold alone. Men needed grain, bread, ale, meat, salt, and whatever local food could be collected, purchased, or seized. Defenders preparing for a siege stored food and water, sometimes beer and wine as well, and tried to reduce the number of mouths inside the walls by sending non-combatants away. They also relied on wells and cisterns because losing usable water could end resistance faster than a breached wall. Attackers had the same problem in reverse. They had to keep a field force fed outside the walls while also feeding the animals that pulled wagons and carried gear. So winter quarters mattered because they gave commanders time to count what was left, decide what had to be brought in, and keep the army from burning through its supplies in a few reckless weeks. Records from the Black Prince's campaign show the same pattern. Once the army went into winter quarters, repairs and resupply began. Supply needs were calculated, letters were sent home, and the next phase of campaigning was organized around provisions. That is the important point. The aim was not comfort. The aim was continuity. In other words, winter survival was not a matter of endurance alone. It was a matter of accounting. A hungry army was slow, angry, and much more likely to desert, mutiny, or scatter. A fed army could wait, patrol, raid, and threaten. That difference is one reason medieval warfare so often turned toward towns, storehouses, mills, river crossings, and castles. Whoever controlled food, or the routes that food moved along, controlled the tempo of winter war. In that sense, supply was not support for strategy. In winter, it was the strategy. Number 3, the horse problem. That food problem became even harder once horses entered the picture. And in medieval Europe, horses entered almost every military picture. They carried knights, moved scouts, pulled wagons, and transported supplies. So when people imagine winter warfare as a test of armored men, they miss the real weak point. The weak point was usually the horse. A horse needed fodder in huge quantities, and winter was the season when fresh grazing failed and stored hay, oats, or beans became essential. Stored dry fodder was vital in winter quarters. That sounds simple, but it explains a lot. If the horses weakened, cavalry lost mobility, carts slowed down, scouting shrank, and even a well-armed army started to feel trapped. Horse losses could wreck an entire campaign. We see just how fragile this was in Charlemagne's Avar campaign of 791, when an equine epidemic reportedly destroyed 90% of the horses in his army, including both war mounts and pack animals. That kind of disaster shows why medieval commanders treated fodder, stabling, and horse care as strategic issues, not background chores. It also explains why winter campaigning often narrowed down to shorter routes, stronger bases, and more careful movement. A commander might accept cold weather. He could not casually accept thousands of underfed or sick animals. That is also why winter work included shoeing horses and repairing transport gear. If the horses failed, the army did not just lose speed. It lost hauling power, scouting reach, and often its best chance to choose when and where to fight. In practical terms, medieval armies did not just ask, "Can the soldiers march?" They also had to ask, "Can the horses still work a week from now?" If the answer was no, the campaign had already started to fail. Number 4, winter quarters. That is why medieval armies did not usually try to live out the whole winter in open fields if they had any better option. They looked for winter quarters. Sometimes that meant a castle or walled town. Sometimes it meant spreading units across defended settlements. Sometimes it meant a large temporary camp in a carefully chosen place. The Viking Great Army's winter camp at Torksey in 872 to 873 is a good example of how deliberate that choice could be. Archaeology shows a large camp on higher ground, partly protected by marshes and bordered by the river Trent. Several thousand people overwintered there, and not just fighters. The site included warriors, craft workers, and merchants, which tells you something important right away. A winter army was not just a line of men waiting for spring. It was a working community that needed trade, repairs, exchange, and access to resources. The evidence from Torksey also suggests metal processing and active exchange, so this was less like a silent bivouac and more like a temporary military town. That is one of the clearest signs that winter campaigning depended on planned settlement, not heroic improvisation. Smiths, traders, and labor were part of combat power. Later medieval examples show the same logic in a more administrative form. Winter quarters were used to guard frontier zones, protect important districts, and serve as bases for smaller operations, while the main army avoided wasteful, large-scale movement. So the phrase winter quarters should not make you imagine total inactivity. It meant controlled activity. The army reduced its exposure, shortened its supply problem, and positioned itself to keep pressure on the enemy. In a way, winter quarters were how commanders turned survival into strategy. They chose places that were defensible, connected, and useful. If a site sat near a river, crossing point, market town, or road junction, that was not luck. It was usually the whole reason the camp existed. Number 5. Staying dry. Of course, even the best winter quarters meant little if men could not stay warm enough to function, and medieval armies handled that less with fancy technology than with materials and routine. In cold or wet parts of Europe, wool outerwear mattered because it was practical, and medieval mantles and related woolen garments were valued precisely for protection in rough weather. Heavy wool outerwear worked well in cold and wet conditions, and mantles were valued in raw, wet climates for a reason. That matters because winter campaigning in Europe was often as much about damp as about snow. A soldier who could keep a cloak, hood, and basic sleeping gear reasonably dry was in a much better state than one who was simply wearing more metal. Heavy woven coverings could matter by day as clothing and by night as protection, which is another reminder that survival depended on ordinary things more than dramatic ones. So warmth came from layers, shelter, and regular camp habits that limited exposure. This is one reason medieval commanders preferred occupied buildings, fortified places, or carefully placed camps when they intended to remain active in winter. The cold was dangerous, but wind and damp could wear men down day after day. A winter force that wanted to stay useful had to preserve hands for work, feet for marching, and enough basic comfort for sleep. Medieval armies did not solve winter with one piece of equipment. They solved it through a system: clothing that matched the climate, shelter that reduced exposure, and a daily rhythm that kept men from slipping from discomfort into sickness. The men who could still grip a spear, hold a rein, and wake up fit to move were the men who had really survived the season. Number 6. Rivers and crossings. The location of winter quarters leads to another point that is easy to miss. Medieval armies survived winter by staying close to movement routes, especially rivers and crossings. At Torksey, the camp stood at a strategically important point in the regional transport network, just south of a river crossing. Studies of Viking winter camps show why that mattered. River crossings acted as nodal points in the landscape because they allowed control of movement and transfer between boat transport and land transport. That matters because winter did not just make movement harder. It made good routes more valuable. A force that held a bridge, ford, port, or crossing could monitor trade, move supplies, threaten nearby regions, and shift troops with less effort than an army stranded on bad roads. It could also make the enemy's movements slower and riskier without needing one giant battle. This helps explain why winter campaigns often feel less dramatic in the chronicles than summer battles. They were frequently about position more than spectacle. Secure the crossing, guard the marches, keep the road open, sit on the enemy's food route, send out smaller detachments instead of one huge army. These winter bases were not passive. Once established, they were used to keep operating. So winter campaigning in medieval Europe was often a game of controlled reach. The commander who could hold a useful node could stay dangerous even with fewer men in the field. In winter, geography became sharper. One crossing, one river bend, one fortified town on a route could matter more than a whole stretch of open land. Number 7. Siege season. This is exactly why sieges mattered so much. Medieval warfare in Europe was dominated by fortified places, and a siege was often the kind of operation most compatible with winter. It was expensive, slow, and exhausting, but it was also predictable in a way that open campaigning was not. Castles and towns were major fortified centers. Sieges were common, and blockade and starvation were standard methods, even though they were lengthy and costly. Defenders knew this, which is why they stockpiled food and water, relied on wells and cisterns, built up stores of arrows, bolts, stones, timber, and earth for repairs, and, when possible, sent non-combatants away to save resources. Attackers knew it too. They needed the money and discipline to sit through bad weather and keep the blockade tight. They also benefited from the fact that a siege concentrated effort. Instead of spending scarce winter resources on long, uncertain marches, they could feed one fixed operation aimed at one fixed target. This is where winter could actually favor the side with stronger organization. If you already had the target surrounded and your own supplies secured, there was no rule saying you had to walk away because the season had changed. In fact, winter could increase pressure on the defenders because every week behind walls meant 1 week closer to empty stores and weaker morale. Charlemagne's siege of Pavia ran through the winter of 773 to 774, and later medieval warfare also produced large, systematic siege campaigns, like the English conquest of Normandy in 1417 to 1419. So, when people picture winter warfare as a desperate snow battle, they often miss the more typical medieval reality. The key winter struggle might be a fortress cut off from food, an army in guarded quarters nearby, and a long contest of supply, repair, and patience. In that kind of war, surviving winter did not mean staying comfortable. It meant staying in place longer than the other side could endure.
Number 8. Living off the land. At the same time, not every army had the money, discipline, or transport to live from stores alone. Very often, winter survival meant taking what the countryside had left, and that is where medieval winter war became especially brutal. The same hay, grain, livestock, and dried fodder that an army wanted were also the very reserves local people needed to survive the season. Once soldiers started seizing them, winter became much harsher for everyone nearby. Stored dry fodder was vital in winter quarters, which means armies were competing for resources that had already been cut, stored, and protected for cold weather. This is why winter raiding could be more destructive than a fast summer sweep. It was not just theft. It was the stripping away of survival stocks. William I's campaign in northern England in the winter of 1069 to 1070 shows the consequences in stark form. The harrying of the north had unusually severe consequences, including famine and a refugee crisis. That does not just tell us that winter campaigns were possible. It tells us how they were often financed in practical terms. Many medieval armies survived winter by forcing someone else to pay for it in food and shelter. So the question of survival was never only about the army itself. It was tied to who controlled barns, herds, mills, smokehouses, and villages. In summer, the countryside could sometimes recover from a passing raid. In winter, the margin was thinner. Taking a region's reserves at that point could break local resistance, but it could also leave a trail of hunger that lasted well beyond the campaign. For a commander, that could be deliberate policy. For the people living there, it was disaster. Number 9. Repairs and paperwork. There is another part of winter campaigning that is not glamorous at all, but it may have mattered more than any heroic charge, and that is administration.
The Black Prince's winter arrangements after the 1355 raid show what serious commanders actually did once the army settled in. They established winter quarters,
guarded the marches, arranged smaller interim operations, paid advance wages, handled reimbursements, shot horses, made repairs, calculated supply needs, and sent messages home to organize resupply. One detail is especially telling. The prince waited to send his report until the army was established in winter encampments and the scale of its supply needs had been determined. That is a revealing list. It means winter survival depended on clerks as much as captains, and on craftsmen as much as knights. The archaeological evidence from Torksey points the same way from a different angle. The winter camp held not only warriors, but also craft workers and merchants, with evidence of metal processing and trade. Put those pieces together, and medieval winter warfare starts to look less like constant combat and more like an ongoing military economy. Gear had to be fixed, horses had to be cared for, payment had to continue or men would drift away. Supplies had to be requested early because delays in winter hurt more. Communication had to remain open. Reports had to reach the ruler or council because resupply did not happen by wishful thinking. In other words, the army had to keep functioning as an institution. This is one of the clearest reasons some medieval rulers could campaign in winter and others could not. It was not just a matter of bravery. It was a matter of whether the government behind the army could keep paper, pay, repairs, and provisioning moving at the same time. A medieval winter campaign was held together by ledgers almost as much as by lances. Number 10. Narrow goals. Once you see all that, the pattern of successful winter campaigning in medieval Europe becomes much easier to read. The armies that stayed effective in winter usually did not try to do everything at once.
They picked tight, practical goals. Hold a frontier, blockade a city, break a revolt, secure a crossing, repair the army and be ready to strike again before the enemy expected it. Charlemagne at Pavia was not wandering across Italy in search of random battle. He was maintaining pressure on a key fortress until it fell. William in 1069 to 1070 was not looking for a neat, tournament-style showdown in northern England. He was destroying the support base of resistance in a brutal winter operation. The Black Prince's forces in 1355 to 1356 used winter quarters not as a retreat from war, but as protected bases for guarding the marches, planning resupply, and preparing fresh action. Even the Viking Great Army's winter camps show the same logic. Choose a defended, connected location, overwinter in strength, keep access to routes and resources, and remain active from that base. This is also why open battle was often a worse winter option than blockade, occupation, or pressure on one district. A lost siege might be recovered. A ruined supply system in January could destroy the whole campaign. So, the real secret of surviving freezing medieval campaigns was not some lost trick of cold weather marching. It was discipline about objectives. Winter punished waste. It punished oversized plans, weak supply, hungry horses, and commanders who confused movement with progress. But if an army had a solid base, enough food and fodder, working routes, and a goal that matched the season, winter did not have to end the campaign at all. It could actually lock an advantage in place and carry the war forward under conditions that weaker opponents could not match.